Welcome to Stories of Sacrifice, World War II American POW-MIAs in the Philippines. This is a production of the U.S. POW-MIA Family Locating. I'm your host and lead researcher, John Barrett.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm here with Mark Kelso. Mark is the grandson of Lieutenant Walter A. Kelso Jr., who was served in the military in the Philippines during World War II. And welcome to the show, Mark. You want to tell us a little more about your grandfather?
Hello, John, and welcome. From Galveston, Texas. My grandfather was Lieutenant Walter Arthur Kelso Jr. Was born here in Galveston, November 27, 1917. Attended Kokura Military Academy, was in the Black Horse Troop, and Tulane University in New Orleans. And after leaving Tulane, took a reserve commission in the cavalry, and came home, married my grandmother, and all of a sudden got a letter from the United States Army that saying, "You owe us a year." And this took place in June of 41, when my dad was born June 26, 1941. 14 days later, my grandfather boarded a train. So my dad was 2 weeks old when he left, boarded a train for Albuquerque Army Airfield, and was assigned to the 19th Bomb Group, 93rd Bombardment Squadron there at Albuquerque. And they spent from July to September of 1941 training at Albuquerque. My grandmother actually did go out there and join him for about a month with my dad. And it was there that my dad got his nickname from all my grandfather's squadron buddies. My dad's nickname was Butch because he was such a big baby. He was given that name by several of the men from the 19th Bomb Group, and that name stuck with him throughout his life. And he passed away about a year and a half ago. But in October of 1941, the 19th Bomb Group was ordered to the Philippines, departed San Francisco aboard the USAT Willard Holbrook on October 4th, and arrived in the Philippines sometime around October 23rd. And he was assigned to Clark Field, 19th Bomb Group, 93rd Squadron. And got several letters from there, detailing the day-to-day life at Clark Field. They were up at 5:30, but all work ended by noon because it was so hot. And then, of course, you know what happened. Clark Field, they were up at 5:30, but sir.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, it was. Everybody was up at 5:30 in the morning, and work was done by noon because it got too hot. And so on December 2nd, 5 days before Pearl Harbor, for some reason he got transferred to the headquarters squadron. And of course, you know what happened to Clark. Clark got bombed, and they were ordered to retreat to Bataan. And the first reading we have of him after that bombing was a telegram he sent from Manila on the 22nd of December saying, "Safe and well, Merry Christmas." You could tell it was sent in a hurry, and they were on the run. But at some point when they were on Bataan, the headquarters squadron was ordered down to Mindanao. And an inter-island steamer called the Mayan picked up the men that were ordered to Mindanao and were taken down there. Of course, the Mayan was attacked on the way down there, but managed to make it all the way down to Bugo, Mindanao, where the men of the 19th Bomb Group that went down there were assigned to the Del Monte Pineapple Plantation Airfield. And this is where he served until he was ordered to surrender in May of 1942. And the first camp that they were sent to was at a place called Malaybalay in Bukidnon. And the reports I read about that camp is it's pretty good. The Japanese let them keep their foot lockers and And they had typewriters here. In fact, I have a receipt that was sent to me by a man named Sergeant Mike Bibbin, I knew what he called himself, that my grandfather signed 2 weeks after the surrender there at Malai. I still have it. He sent it to me back in 2003. He found it amongst his things when I was doing my research. So they stayed there until November of 1942, where they were sent down to DeVal Penal Colony. And this was going to be home for about 2 years. And upon arrival at DeVal Penal Colony, next reading I have him was the Japanese interpreter, whose name was Nishimura, pulled him out of the line because he was the biggest man in the line. My grandfather was 6'5", so he's a pretty big guy. And Nishimura had his horse whip and hit him across the face with a horse whip. And of course, this guy was known amongst the prisoners as Simon Legree. But at DeVal Penal Colony, he was in Barracks A1, which is next to the kitchen. And from the men I've talked to that knew him there at DeVal, he had 2 jobs. He worked in the rice fields quite often, but he also worked on something called a telephone detail. Apparently, there was a telephone system there at DeVal, or an intercom system. And another prisoner, Maynard Booth, said they worked the chicken coops together. So pretty interesting. But the one story about his time at DeVal Penal Colony, which was sent to me in a letter by a man named Roy Russell, who was a Shinyo Maru survivor, who was his bay mate there at DeVal Penal Colony. One Sunday morning, he came in and saw my grandfather cooking a pot of stew. Well, there was no meat there at DeVal Penal Colony, and Roy asked my grandfather, he said, well, where'd you get the meat? And he said, your grandfather looked up at me with a half a smile, and he said, Okubo's dog. Apparently, Sergeant Okubo was one of the prisoner war guards at DeVal Penal Colony who had this dog. Well, apparently the dog had wandered into the camp the night before, and I guess my grandfather was using the latrine and caught this dog, and ended up being the Sunday dinner. So
And a little payback.
Yeah, a little payback from Sergeant Okubo. Well, Sergeant Okubo, I looked him up. He apparently was apprehended as a war criminal and held at Sugamo for a little while. I don't have his file yet. The archives are shut down because of COVID. Well, the next reading we have of him was the Japanese decided to go ahead and close DeVal Penal Colony in June of 1944. And they shipped the first group, left on to go to Lasang and build the runway for the Japanese. This was the group that ended up on the Shinyo Maru. Well, the other group that stayed at DeVal and didn't go to Lasang ended up leaving on the Yashu Maru on June 25th, 1944. They stopped in Cebu, were held at Fort Santiago for, I think it's Fort San Pedro. I can't remember the name, but they were held there for a couple of days. And then another ship came in, the Guyana Maru. There's some, I guess you could say debate on what the name of this ship was, but I got the name from a diary of a Lieutenant Earl Halsey, who was on that ship with my grandfather. And interesting or not, Lieutenant Halsey and my grandfather knew each other before the war because their fathers were in business together. So yeah, Halsey was a P-40 pilot. Anyway, they went back to Luzon and were put in Bilibid prison. Well, half of the group that was aboard the Guyana Maru went on the Canadian Venner to Japan, and the other half went to Cabanatuan. This was mid-July 1944, and so the next reading I have of him is a postcard that was sent from Cabanatuan in July of 44. But after the war, Lieutenant Ken Wheeler, who eventually became Vice Admiral Ken Wheeler, who was also in the Orioca Maru, but was in the same barracks as my grandfather when they arrived at Cabanatuan, made a statement that a certain guard named Kazutani Aihara, which the prisoners called air raid,
air raid, decided
he was going to do his thing with several prisoners, and one of them was my grandfather. Took a pretty severe beating from him. So, then they roll on to around mid-October. I think October 17th was the day I tracked down his movement from Cabanatuan back to Bilibid for shipment to Japan. And they stayed there at Bilibid for 2 months because of the air raids and all that kind of good stuff. Well, a typhoon or something that come through that part of the world, and the Orioka Maru got orders to go ahead and berth on sometime between December 5th and December 10th. And she came in and loaded cargo, and orders came on December 12th for the 1,621 men to move out the next morning, and board the Orioka Maru. And they called morning Tenko the next day, and probably about 11 o'clock, the columns started marching out of Bilibid prison, 1,621 men in columns of 4, led by Colonel Curtis Beecher, and marched down to Pier 7 from Bilibid prison through the streets of Manila.
Yeah, let me interrupt you here real quick.
Go ahead, sure.
And by this time that they're getting ready to enter or board the hell ships, is how they refer to them. What was their condition like? Their health?
Oh, they'd been prisoners for 2.5 years. Dysentery was rampant. They've been on a reduced diet. I don't know how this got out, but my grandfather was able to send a postcard that said he was down to 180 pounds. For a guy that had a 6'5" football player frame, down to 180 pounds, that was pretty significant. So, yeah.
Yeah, you want to pull up a picture? We'll show a picture.
Yeah, sure. Let me get my screen. Actually, you've got the early pictures. You've got the football and the football player and then the Black Horse Troop screen. I've got the Orioka Maru stuff.
Well, I pulled that up. Go ahead and I just wanted to so that everybody or the listeners knew about kind of the condition they were in by this point, because
they were in pretty bad shape. This, like I said, the diseases and the diet was pretty horrible.
By this time, it wasn't too long before the Rangers, before we actually landed back on the Philippines.
Yeah, 2 weeks later, the 6th Army landed in Lingayen.
Exactly, and that's not long after Cabanatuan was liberated.
Right. In fact, I think Walter Kruger's, they invaded January 6th is when the Lingayen landings took, and I'm getting to I'll get to that story later. But that same beach that the Orioka Maru survivors boarded the second hell ship on December 26th was the same beach that, there he is. That's his Tulane University football picture. He, again, was about 6'5". He wore a size 14 shoe.
Holy cow!
He was a big guy, and you show that picture next to his horse at Kokura Military Academy. That's him at 18 years old. That's him right before he left. There's a picture right over there with the horse. You can actually see how big he was. And
that's a pretty tall thoroughbred horse right there.
Yes, it is. The Kokura Military Black Horse Troop. Those horses aren't little.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry for interrupting you there.
Oh, no, that's okay. No, absolutely jump in any time. I get to talking and I get to not paying attention to the background. But anyway, the prisoners started boarding the Orioka Maru about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Of course, it was hot, and they were actually down in the deep holds of the ship. The Orioka Maru was what we call a tween decker. There was a kind of mid deck between the main deck and the cargo hold. So the prisoners were down in the cargo hold. So it was down in the bowels of the ship. And I don't know who made the loading plan, but they had the ship loaded pretty awkward. Now I know they wanted to trim the ship down to the stern, so they put most of the prisoners, about 800 out of the 1,600, in the rear hold, and the rear hold was one of the smaller holds. And I think they had another 600 and something in the forward hold, and the middle hold right in front of the wheelhouse, about 280, which was one of the men I talked to was in that hold and said it wasn't that uncomfortable. But of course, the rear hold and the forward hold were the nightmares. They were overcrowded. The men, they were bouncing off each other. Fights were breaking out. They were going crazy from dehydration and exposure. And I've heard estimates that that first night after the ship got underway, it actually stopped off a Corregidor to take on coal before it got underway to Formosa. And that night was just absolutely a nightmare. They estimate that over 30 prisoners either suffocated or were murdered. There were actually some murders going on because the men were going stark raving crazy with with the heat and the conditions, it was just not not a very good place to be.
No, in fact, the Japanese weren't letting them out of the holes of the ship to defecate, like that. So
nothing honey buckets, and it was just not pretty. A good friend of mine. Sorry, go ahead, John.
Most of these men at this time were all, had dysentery and malaria.
Oh yeah.
Very,
you can imagine that. It looked like a dog kennel.
Oh yeah, the diarrhea, the whole, the whole works, and I couldn't even imagine what the condition they were in that hole with no ventilation and the heat, and it's unmanageable, or manageable, or imaginable.
Right. Well, and a good friend of mine, Professor Jim Erickson, whose father was in the forward hold, got a hold of the billable transfer roster, which had the transfer orders for the men to go on the Orinoco Maru, and was able to pretty much determine with pretty darn accuracy where all the men on the roster were in the hold, based on their position in the line to march, and he's been pretty spot on. The men I've talked to all confirmed that they were in this hold or that hold, and my grandfather was in that rear hold. He was in that hold with the large amount. Well, anyway, like I said, the Orinoco Maru got underway that afternoon and anchored off of Corregidor and took on bunkers that night. Well, the next morning she got underway about 6:30 in the morning and started making a run up the coast of Bataan. Well, the U.S. Navy had the Philippines pretty much blockaded, and were running aerial reconnaissance from the aircraft carriers. The Hancock was there, the Hornet was there, Task Force 38 was flying constant air patrol and strike missions since before the Lady invasion, since September. Well, a ship the size of the Orinoco Maru in clear weather starts making a run up the Bataan coast. It's going to get spotted, and sure enough, it did. And I've got that picture here, if I can share my screen. She was spotted that morning, early morning, off the coast of Bataan, and I went ahead and zoomed in, and here's the first picture of the Orinoco Maru off the coast, the western coast of Bataan. She's got a bone in her teeth. She's moving fast, probably 15, 20 knots, trying to make some headway. And this is when the Navy first spotted her. Well, of course, the Navy guys get on the radio, and they decided to give her a party, and find the picture. And they attacked the Orinoco Maru several times throughout the day. In fact, here's one of the first strike photographs. This is at the mouth of Subic Bay. Let me zoom out a little bit. At Sueste Point. In fact, that I was able to identify where the ship was based on this rock formation. This picture was taken about 11 o'clock in the morning. And during the attacks, the captain stated that the rudder in the stern tube was damaged. So he had to beach, to keep the ship from sinking, he had to beach the Orinoco Maru there at the mouth of Subic Bay. And another pretty good shot of her.
Yeah, what happened back then was the Japanese on these hell ships, they didn't mark them with the Red Cross or let or advertise them that they were even transporting POWs, and right. So our own forces were attacking these ships, sure. Cargo, and
the Geneva Convention called for ships carrying prisoners to have a green cross.
Exactly.
And this is one of the things that really stinks about this, is that Lieutenant Junzaburo Toshino, who was the Japanese guard commander, the person in charge of the escort of the troops, claims he put a green cross on the deck of the ship, which was totally untrue.
Yeah, well, these pictures tell the truth.
Right, exactly. The pictures are real clear. In fact, this is one of the best shots of the Orinoco Maru. This is mid-morning on the 14th. The front hatch cover is open in this picture, but the rear is closed. And I noticed there's a lifeboat in the water there. It's off the davit into the water. I guess the captain had asked this is only a hypothesis, but I guess the captain had asked the crew to go check out the damage to the stern of the ship, because that's where most of the damage was done to the rudder. So that was on the 14th, and during the, of course, the night of the 14th was a repeat of the night of the 13th in the holds. It was horrible. Like I said, murders and fights and just all kind of mayhem going on. The man who was in charge of the rear hold, Commander Warner Ports, he kind of just wore out. So Commander Francis Bridget actually took over in the rear hold of the ship and try to get some order there. In fact, his exploits on the York Maru are legendary. In fact, they named a destroyer after him in the 60s. The USS Bridget.
Yep.
The middle hold, and which is another interesting, the midship hold was under the command of a man named Colonel Harold K. Johnson, who eventually became the Chief of Staff of the Army in the 1960s. And of course, the forward hold was commanded by Colonel Curtis Beecher, who was also the commander at Cabanatuan. Well, during the night, the Orioca Maru was obviously damaged. It could not move under its own power because of the rudder problems. So the Japanese brought some tugs from the Subic Bay Navy base and towed the Orioca Maru during the night into the inner harbor, about 300 yards off of the Lava Pier. Well, the U.S. Navy found the ship again, and the next morning decided they were going to give them a party again. So this is where the Orioca Maru actually met its match. Let me find my wares here. Sorry about the delay. So the Navy attacked the ship, and the first, in fact, one of the famous photographs, one of the first attacks. This is not a real widely seen photograph, but you can actually see the large amount of smoke. This is really real close to the actual attack of the Orioca Maru, and you can see here the Riviera Point here at Subic Bay. Now the Lava Pier. If you see a modern picture of Subic Bay, the Lava Pier is right here where the aircraft carriers used to dock. And let me find another picture for you that's. Here's a close-up of the one I just showed you. Again, you can see the ship pretty well, and the superstructure of the ship, and the damage where the Navy had. They had a direct 500-pound bomb hit directly into the rear hold, killing about 235 to 250 American prisoners. Yeah. So, and of course, the famous photograph, the splash photograph, which is the one everybody makes reference to. Just a little later picture, the fire has gone out a little bit, and you can actually see the superstructure of the ship a little better. And these splashes in the water, a lot of the people I know claim that those are the prisoners, and I would agree, because you've got a bunch of men leaving the rear hold and a bunch of people leaving the forward hold.
So. Yeah, didn't the Japanese at this time also shoot at those guys that were?
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. In fact, the Japanese Naval Landing Force had set up machine guns at the Subic Bay seawall, and if anybody got out of the zone, you got machine gun. In fact, I think they just fired the machine guns because they felt like it. There were several people that were killed in the water. Captain Ted Parker. But there were 2 escapes from the Orioca. 3 escapes, actually. There was a Private Darnell Cadoff, Lieutenant George Petridge, and then there was a British sergeant who we discovered, Jim Erickson actually discovered a few years ago, had escaped from the Orioca Maru and hid out with a Filipino family, but unfortunately he died. Oh. So, the conventional wisdom that there were 2 men that escaped, but there were actually 3. So, but the Navy kept coming back and attacking the Orioca Maru throughout the day, even after the prisoners are off. In fact, here's the last picture of the Orioca Maru before she sunk. I'll get to it in a second. And there it is. I mean, she's completely engulfed in flames. This is about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And again, the ship is going down, and the superstructure is on fire, and she was pretty much underwater by 5 o'clock that afternoon.
Yeah.
Well, the Japanese then put the men in. They carted them into a tennis court. They're at the old Subic Bay Navy base, and took a while to try to figure that out because a lot of the prisoners didn't exactly know where it was. They made references to it being by the Spanish Gate or other places. But Chad Hill, I don't know if you know Chad, and I debated on where the tennis court was, and we combed over these photographs, and we actually located it. It was pretty much adjacent to the end of the Subic Bay seawall, and you can actually see this enclosed picture. And I'll bring up the splash photograph and highlight where it is. It's right around here.
Okay.
So there's the ship on fire, and the tennis court was right around on the edge of this grove of trees. Let me find a better picture for you. Hey, there you go. You can see it better there. Let me zoom in. But yeah, this is the splash photograph, and you can see the tennis court clearly enclosed a little bit south and a little bit east of the ship. Here's Subic Bay. Here's the end of the seawall. So, but the men were held there for 6 days. The December 13th. In fact, here's the 5 o'clock picture. We went ahead and zoomed in on the tennis court, and you can't see the chalk lines anymore. So the men are actually on the tennis court here. Zooming in, you really you can't see the men individually, but you can see that the tennis court's chalk lines are obscured by something. So the Japanese had moved the men, or started putting the men on the tennis court by the time this picture was taken. And I think there were around 1,344 men still alive. And they stayed there for 5 days. And between 8 and 14 men are rumored to have passed away on the tennis court. The conventional wisdom by the commanders is that there were 8. And I can find between 8 and 10 possibles. And they were buried about 40 yards, according to reports, buried about 40 yards south of the tennis court towards the Subic Bay seawall. So that's pretty much what happened on the tennis court. And in fact, there's one of the IDPFs that is kind of the central file for the tennis court. And then, of course, the next phase, the San Fernando phase, is Lieutenant William Hogaboom. He was one of the poor souls that was wounded on the Orinoco Maru that ended up being buried outside the tennis court. And I've spoken to his family; they're still looking for him. And his IDPF is a wealth of information because apparently that's where they decided to deposit all the investigation files for the tennis court. It's a Rosetta Stone for what happened. Does anybody have any questions out there? Or?
No, can you hear me all right?
Hello?
Can you hear me all right?
Barely.
Yeah, the internet's kind of messing up here.
Okay. Can you still hear me? I can barely hear you.
I can hear you.
Okay, you're fading in and out. You're kind of buzzing.
Okay, yeah, we'll just keep rolling. It might get better here.
Okay. Well, from the tennis court, the Japanese sent word on a destroyer. In fact, I got the Japanese soldier's name. The Toshino sent a runner back on a Japanese destroyer from Subic Bay back to Manila to let them know what happened. And they reported to General Quo's headquarters that the Orinoco Maru had been sunk, and that Lieutenant Toshino had 1,344 American prisoners, some in pretty serious shape, cantoned in on this tennis court at the Subic Bay Navy base. And the next day, a group of trucks that were sent out under Lieutenant Kenpai Yuki arrived at Olongapo and started to do what they could for the men there. They got uniforms and some cauldrons and some rice. And so the decision was made to continue with the journey. And a group of trucks arrived from Bilibid and the first group of prisoners left Olongapo from the tennis court for San Fernando, Pampanga in mid-Luzon. And this first group of prisoners were quartered at the provincial jail, which is directly behind the provincial capital. And that first night, again, about half the prisoners were put there. And then the next day, the trucks came and picked up the rest of them about noon and on the 21st and took the rest, and they quartered them in a theater / cockfighting pit there right on the Pampanga River across from the provincial capital. Well, this is where it starts getting interesting. Several of the men were not in really good shape after the Orinoco Maru bombing and the conditions aboard the ship. So some of the men died. In fact, the first two men that passed away in the provincial jail were Lieutenant Commander John Liddig and Colonel Harry Harper. They passed away the morning of the 21st. And this is where the logistics of the whole San Fernando incident start to take place. The Japanese decided that they were going to bury these two men, and they found a cemetery on the outskirts of town, again south of the Pampanga River, called the Campo Santo de San Fernando. And this cemetery is going to end up being the scene for probably one of the most treacherous war crimes that were committed during this time. So the Japanese took these two bodies in and buried them in a grave. And over the next 2 days, another 4 men died, including Lieutenant Eugene Specht, whose arm was amputated on the tennis court. A lot of people thought that Specht had died on the tennis court, and some of the diaries and statements indicate it did. But there's one deposition from Colonel Jack Swartz that stated that Specht died in the theater, in the cockpit, and his body was actually found in one of those graves in San Fernando. So, well, 4 men died between the 21st and 23rd, and the Japanese made the second trip to the cemetery and dug another grave and buried the other 4 men. I've got a spreadsheet which details that. Well, that evening, an officer and a medical master sergeant came down from Manila. They were ordered down there by General Quo. The man's name was Lieutenant Urabe. And if you look at some of the postcards that were sent out of the Philippines, the prisoner of war postcards, a lot of them, Urabe was the censor. He was the Japanese censor. Yep. So General Quo dispatched Urabe and Lieutenant Yuki to San Fernando to assist Toshino in getting the men to the second ship, which ended up being the Norma Maru at the Lingayen Gulf. They brought with them a man named Master Sergeant Sukatoshi Tanoe. That night of the 23rd, before the move, Toshino and Urabe had a conference, and it was decided that Lieutenant Urabe told Toshino that the sick and wounded prisoners, the sickest and the most wounded prisoners, would not be able to make the journey, that they needed to be executed. So Toshino called his interpreter, Shisuke Wada, to his office and told him to instruct the American doctors, who ended up being Colonel Jack Swartz and Commander Kerry Smith, to pick the sickest and wounded prisoners of war to go. Well, this is where it gets conflicting. The Japanese state there were 15. Yep. Colonel Swartz, in his immediate post-war deposition, states there were a dozen. And we'll get into that in a minute. But I never could get the numbers to reconcile until I actually read these exhumation reports. Well, anyway, they load these men on a truck, and they take them to this Campo Santo de San Fernando cemetery, where the Japanese had already been twice that day to bury again, Colonel Harper and Colonel Harper and Commander Liddig and the other 4 men that passed away while they were waiting for the San Fernando train to get there to take them to Lingayen. Well, they decided to execute these men, and they led them one by one from the truck to the grave. The soldiers had dug the grave, And Toshino ordered Master Sergeant Downing to decapitate him. So they would lead them one by one to the edge of the grave. And of course, the men were not in very good shape. Some of the men had broken arms, broken legs, and they would put them on the edge of the grave, and while Tanaui would decapitate him, the guards Jiro Ueda and Katsutuni Gaihara, there's that name again, air raid, would bayonet him. And they did this with all the men that were chosen by the American doctors, and they were covered up and left there. But the problem is they left a witness. Yep. They left a witness, and that witness was the caretaker of the cemetery, who, after the war, in Toshino's war crimes trial, was a pretty reliable source, pretty reliable primary source to what happened over those 5 days in San Fernando. And I've got a picture there. San Fernando is not that big a town. But if something happens there, everybody's going to know about it. So, all right, well, the men then took a train from the San Fernando rail station, the same one the Bataan Death March guys went through, to San Fernando La Union, which is on the northern end of Luzon, on the beach up there. And they waited for the next ship, which the next two ships actually being the Nora Maru and the Brazil Maru. So Christmas, the day after Christmas, the rest of the men boarded those two ships. I think there was 1,100 aboard the Nora Maru and 250 aboard the Brazil Maru, and they proceeded to get underway to Formosa, to Takao, Formosa, which is now Kaohsiung, Taiwan, where they arrived on New Year's Day. And the Brazil Maru pulled up to the berth to load cargo, and the Nora Maru was tied up to a sea buoy. On the 6th of January, the men from the Brazil Maru, the 250 from the Brazil Maru, were moved back to the Nora Maru. And I guess the Nora Maru was waiting to berth the load of cargo when the U.S. Navy found the ship on January 9th. Same squadron, VF-11 from the USS Hornet, same group of pilots that attacked the Orioke Maru, discovered the Nora Maru in Takao. And I've got the strike photograph of that. I'll bring it up. Here's the combat camera footage, again from the USS Hornet VF-11 of Takao Harbor on January 9th. And the ships down here in this nest, the outboard ship is the Nora Maru. And we're thinking this is the Brazil Maru right here. But a lot of the Brazil Marus, the particular class of the Brazil Maru, she was a World War I standard freighter, which was a dead copy of the Aden Maru British class. A lot of the older Japanese freighters were very similar to the British Aden Maru class. They were built by that was one of the ways that the Japanese contributed to World War I, is that the Kawasaki shipyard contributed ships, because the Japanese were on our side in World War I. Well, they saw these ships left over, and they used them in World War II. But here is the strike photograph of the Nora Maru. The ship has already been bombed. Let me get my high res here. And you can actually see the ship nest of the Kuroshio Maru here, and the Nora Maru here. You can already see the bomb blast. This killed about, they estimate, approximately 350 American prisoners that were in that forward hold. The Japanese pretty much left the prisoners alone for a day or so. They got some medics to come on board and spread some urocurone, but that was about it. Well, they finally decided the evening of the 11th to get the bodies off the Nora Maru, and they put together a 20-man detail of reasonably healthy prisoners. Ken Wheeler, Jim Keene, Jack Heinzel are three of the ones I know about, and their job was to get the bodies off the Nora Maru and bury them ashore. So over the next 2 days, that was their job. They assisted the the Chinese laborers in getting these men off the Yonomaru, and they buried them ashore behind the inner harbor. Finally, on the evening of the 13th, the remaining men alive, there's about 940, were put aboard the Brazil Maru, and they started to get underway for Japan. And this journey started on the 14th of January and lasted 2 weeks because the Brazil Maru was a very old and slow ship, and had stopped several times because of engine breakdowns and to tow other damaged ships. And plus, the captain decided to stay out of the open water because of the submarine activity. So she hugged the Chinese coast.
Yeah.
In fact, the captain wanted to bring the Brazil Maru. The captain of the Brazil Maru was the same captain of the Orioke Maru, Shin Kajiyama. He actually took over the Brazil Maru after the Orioke Maru was sunk. So Kajiyama wanted to pull into Shanghai because there were 30 to 40 men dying per day on the Brazil Maru. And Lieutenant Toshino refused. He said the death rate's going down. That was his quote. So Kajiyama listed a formal protest with Toshino about January 20th, right off the coast of Shanghai. Well, the next 9 days, they steamed toward Japan and made a mad dash across the Sea of Japan to the Shimonoseki Straits, where the Brazil Maru actually made the pilot station about the evening of January 28th. And the next morning, she took her pilot and berthed at the Moji docks on the 29th. Between Formosa and Japan, they were burying 30 to 40 men a day. They started off with around 960 men. When they arrived at the port of Moji, Japan, which is on the northern edge of Kyushu between the Shimonoseki Straits, there were 581 bodies aboard. And out of those 960 that left Taiwan 2 weeks earlier, only 547 were alive. So these 37 men were dead on arrival, and they were taken off the ship and cremated and entered under Fukuoka number 4. And for some reason, their remains ended up being buried at the Commonwealth Cemetery in Yokohama, the Charnel House.
Yeah, that's crazy why they took so far away.
Right. So that was the men that arrived dead on the Brazil Maru. Well, the rest of the men were divided into 4 groups. The first group was the hospital group, 110 men, which my grandfather was one of these 110 men that were wounded or too sick to move. And they were immediately loaded on trucks and taken to the Kokura Military Hospital. And this is where my grandfather met his end on February 4th, 1945, 5 days after the Brazil Maru docked. After the war, my grandmother was contacted by 3 of the men who were there with him who actually survived. Out of the 110 men, only 34 survived. 110 men that went to the Kokura Military Hospital, only 34 men survived. So that is the dysentery ward. The ward in the hospital was 2 wards. The ward in the back was for the wounded, and the ward in the front, you can see the toilet boxes were for the dysentery patients. According to Art Beale, who was also at this hospital, he was wounded in the foot during the Orioke Maru bombing, is that only one prisoner survived the front ward, and that was a man named Lieutenant Ed Koenig. And then they were when the men died, they were documented. The person doing the documentation was Lieutenant Colonel Virgil McCollum, who eventually later would become one of the commanders of the Bataan Corridor Society. But he was the officer who was documenting the deaths there, and that's indicated on my grandfather's IDPF. The other 2 eyewitnesses to his death were a man named Lieutenant George Faulkner, who was also in the 19th Bomb Group, 93rd Squadron. He was a B-17 pilot. His B-17 got destroyed on the ground, so unfortunately George made the Bataan Death March and all that kind of good stuff. And the other was Jack Heinzel. Jack Heinzel was a pilot in the 93rd Squadron. Not Jack, but John Lester, Major John Lester, who was in the 19th Group, 440th in Aviation Support Group, who was at Del Monte with my grandfather at Del Monte Field, Mindanao. He was also in that hospital. So there's the death certificate signed by the Japanese doctor. But I have also had the 2 letters from Lieutenant Faulkner and Major Lester after the war. So, and with this death certificate, it pretty much confirms where he died.
Yeah.
Sunday, February 4th, 1945 at 3:00 in the morning. So that's the story, but it doesn't end there. I mean, we can go on with
When did they bring his remains back home?
His remains were brought home in February 1948. And are buried about 20 miles north of where I'm sitting. In fact, I'm living in his house. This is the house. The house I'm living in now is the house that he and my grandmother built. I inherited it from my dad last year and decided instead of selling it to go ahead and just fix it up. So I spent 8 months fixing it up.
Oh, nice.
Making it a home for my wife and son. So
exactly.
Yeah. Yep. So does anybody have any questions or?
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, type them in the chat. If not, you can call them phone numbers in the chat there. So
sure.
So these other ones that were, we'll go back to the tennis courts and stuff.
Okay.
Now, how many were killed there?
They estimate that between 8 and 14. I've got a piece of paper in William Hogaboom's IDPF that says 14, but Jim Erickson's roster, based on other sources that I have, war crimes depositions, statements from Colonel Beecher, indicate 8. 8 was kind of the number everybody had agreed on, and that's what I can pretty much reconcile as firm based on the diaries and statements, is that 8 men died on the tennis court and were buried about between 40 and 80 yards due south of the tennis court towards the Subic Bay seawall. And that's another interesting story. Is in 1947 they were doing some infrastructure work at the base. They were digging a water line just south of where the old tennis court was, and they discovered 5 bodies. They discovered 5 sets of remains. Of course, these remains didn't have any identification on them. They'd been in the Filipino soil for 2 years, and the Manila Mausoleum, the graves registration unit, was not able to ID them positively. Right. But it's pretty clear that these guys were, some of those Orinoco Maru casualties because of where they were buried. I've got a picture here that a friend of mine sent me, Chad Hill, who's the tennis court is his thing.
Yeah, he's a good researcher.
Chad, I've met Chad in Washington, and we've come through files together. He's really good. But I'll find that picture he sent me, which shows the graves registration team in 1947 finding those bodies. And Chad actually documented. These are the Sergeant Horace Allison's grave registration team from the Manila Mausoleum, exhuming those 5 bodies. And you can see in the background, there's the end of the Subic Bay seawall, and there's the road. You can actually see both of these landmarks in the splash photograph. I'll bring the splash photograph up again. Bring the high res up and zoom in. You can actually see there's the tennis court. You can actually see the end of the Subic Bay seawall right here.
Oh yeah,
right there's the end of the Subic Bay seawall, and there's the road that the back of that picture is indicating. So Chad was pretty much spot on there, and those X-files are X1479, 1480, 1481, 1482, 1486, and 1487. Manila Mausoleum. So they're still buried as unknowns in Manila. And we know who they are.
Yeah. Aaron Jimison's in the chat there. He's a Navy veteran, and he was in been to Super
Oh, yeah?
Bay. He made a comment there that the base did not change much from 41 to the late 80s.
Mm-mm.
So yeah,
That tennis court was actually used as a parking lot for the BOQ.
okay.
Yeah, if you say the BOQ, that the parking lot was the old tennis court. I think the Legenda Hotel is on top of the tennis court right now. If my Google Earth serves me well.
Exactly.
So
exactly. And then the guys that died over there at the cockpit, or what I call
right,
cockpit.
those guys in San Fernando, Pampanga. That was after the move from the tennis court. They were all again taken to San Fernando, Pampanga, and buried in that cemetery. Well, they exhumed those graves after the war, and they were, I think, out of the 18 bodies they found, they were only able to identify 10, and I think there was a mis-ID. Yeah. So we did pull the American Graves registration reports and the quartermaster reports from that exhumation, and then you have to actually take it from the exhumation to they give them an initial X number. Back then it was San Fernando X1 through whatever, and then it went to United States Air Force Cemetery, an AGRS unit there in Manila, where they were given different X numbers. X, I think it's 422 through whatever. And then they opened the Manila Mausoleum where all these remains were sent then and given new X numbers.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Like, it's nuts. X8, 890, 891. And you have to follow this chain of evidence all the way until the investigation was closed in 1953, which they reverted to their old X number.
Yeah, exactly.
Of what it was before they were sent to the Manila Mausoleum. And the war crimes trial by then was over, so the discovery evidence of who these men were was pretty clear. But again, I guess the information was restricted, and there wasn't a real good two-way communication between the Graves registration people in Manila and the war crimes trial in Yokohama.
Yeah.
As if I have a, this is just my theory. If those two would have been communicating, those 10 minutes, San Fernando would have been ID'd. Exactly. Some of them were. Marine Colonel Freeney was ID'd. I think who else? Dr. Melvin Swanson was ID'd. I think there were 8 total, but there was 10 that are still MIA. And go ahead.
You had researched one of them. You had kind of a real interesting story.
Right.
About
this, yeah. There's this one young second lieutenant who was executed. He was beheaded by the Japanese. Who for some reason I wonder what his story was. He had a foreign sounding name, and I grew up in a town here in Galveston where there were a lot of Eastern European Jews. Very very tight community. And I grew up with their children. So, me, the Episcopalian, all my friends growing up are Jewish. So I would go to their houses for Hanukkah and the traditions. And so when I read his name, the first name Hyman, that's a very Hebrew name. That's a very, very Jewish name. So I said, I'm going to check this kid out. And I tried for years to track down Hyman Victor Sherman. And you know how many Hyman Victor Shermans there were in New York? Because everybody changed their name. All the Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe changed their name. So trying to find this one Hyman Victor Sherman just was elusive. And it actually came to fruition about 6 months ago. I've got a good friend and his wife, Dr. Bill Sherman, and we were sitting around the campfire, having dinner and all that. And Bill's Jewish, and I said, Bill, I'm going to throw a Hail Mary here. I'm looking for the family of a guy named Hyman Victor Sherman, who was a Jewish kid from New York. And he said, well, I have a family historian who can start digging for you. And then, of course, the gate opened up. The family historian got back to me and said, well, he wasn't always Hyman Victor Sherman. His real name was Hyman Soussi, Soussi. And then the story got even more interesting. Hyman Soussi and his family, he was born in Smyrna, Turkey. Prior to World War I and during the Ottoman Empire, that Anatolia region of Asia Minor had pretty significant populations of Greeks. A lot of them are Greek Orthodox, and a very, very tiny Greek Jewish community called the Janinas. Well, young Hyman and his family were part of that community. Well, as World War I wound down and the power vacuum of the Ottoman Empire collapsed, you start to see the rise of the Turkish nationalists. They wanted Asia Minor to be theirs, and then the old colonial powers of England, France, and not as much the United States were divvying up that part of the world. And two separate treaties were negotiated separately because Versailles couldn't decide what to do with the region. So the Turks signed separate treaties with the French and the British, and it ended up that that part of Asia Minor, the Greek minorities had to leave.
Yep.
And they were well, I mean, in 1919, the Greeks actually invaded that part of the world thinking it was theirs. And of course, the Turks protested. By 1921, the Turks were on the offensive. The Turks were pushing them out. So young Hyman and his family, it was grandma, mom, dad, two sisters, and Hyman, made their way to Marseille, France.
Yep.
I don't know how that's the big thing. I don't know how they got there, but
apparently that group of Jewish community was actually under the protection of the French.
Oh, were they? So that means they went on. That means they went on the Fabre line, because Fabre line was the line that operated out of that region.
Correct.
And they were processed in Marseille, and in July of 1921, they boarded a Fabre ship called the Roma, and landed in Providence, Rhode Island. I've got the landing report of the whole family. He entered the United States as Victor Sherman. I guess he wanted to sound a little more anglicized, but it was the grandmother, his father Samuel, his mother Anna, his sister Suzanne, the other sister Sarah, and of course Hyman.
Yep.
And they settled in Brooklyn, New York. They left Providence and settled in the Bronx, actually. And the next reading I have of Lieutenant Sherman was he was a high school student at DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx, and that's where he graduated from high school in 1930. Then I found his petition for naturalization in 1932. This is where we start to see the name Hyman Victor Sherman. He actually changed his name on his naturalization papers from Hyman Susi, or from Victor Susi, to Hyman Victor Sherman. And what's interesting is his sisters, Sarah and Suzanne, also changed their first and last name. Sarah became, Suzanne actually became Estelle.
Stell,
And then, then the other sister changed her name. I'm not clear. I don't have my notes in front of me.
I don't
But when they were naturalized Americans, they became American citizens. They changed both their first and their last name to Estelle and Suzanne Sherman. Their father actually died in the Bronx in 1931, and this is where I figured out, because the Society for the Janina, which is the Greek Jewish community, buried their father in Mount Carmel Cemetery in Brooklyn. So I traced the synagogue. They attended a synagogue in Manhattan, the Janina community, very, very small Greek Jewish community. But their synagogue is still there in Manhattan. And this is where young Hyman and his family actually attended worship. Well, I've got about an 8-year gap there in his life until he shows up at Fort Ord, California in 1940. And it wasn't just Hyman that showed up out there. It was the whole family. The whole family migrated to Los Angeles while I guess he was doing his military service. Well, at some point in 1940, 1941, Hyman again is an enlisted man and is sent to the Philippines, where he is attached to the 53rd Infantry Regiment of the Philippine Army. Well, of course, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and somehow young Sergeant Sherman is now Second Lieutenant Hyman Sherman.
Yeah, field promoted.
They battlefield promoted him. Well, of course, the 53rd Infantry surrendered at Maryville's, and Lieutenant Sherman made the Bataan Death March, ended up at O'Donnell and Cabanatuan, and found himself in 1944, in December 1944, in the rear hold of the Orinoco Maru. He boarded the ship about 5 or 6 ranks behind my grandfather. So they were in the same vicinity. And during that bombing of the Orinoco Maru, I've seen reports that Lieutenant Sherman was wounded. So he did get off the ship, made it to the tennis court, but by the time they got to San Fernando, he was in pretty bad shape. And this poor Jewish kid, Greek Jewish kid from Turkey, who pretty much kicked out of every place in his life, met his death at the end of the sword of Master Sergeant Sukatoshi Tanawi. And after the war, they had a preliminary ID of Lieutenant Sherman as X425, but that ID was rejected by Board of Review because of a discrepancy in the tooth chart.
Which weren't very accurate anyway.
No, they weren't very accurate. I mean, this tooth chart was taken in 1940 at Fort Ord, and of course, after 3 years as a POW and then getting your head chopped off, things are going to change. So
they actually had dentists there at Cabatuan where he was at.
Right, they did. There was a Dr. Roy Bodine was the dentist there at Cabatuan, and he has a journal out there too called I can't remember. He wrote a diary. I've got a copy of it. For the life of me, I can't remember. I got so much on my brain about the Oregon right now. I can't remember all the diaries names. But Dr. Roy Bodine, who was actually Colonel Roy Bodine, he died in San Antonio about 15 years ago. He wrote a very good diary where he goes over the incidents of San Fernando. All right, so poor Lieutenant Sherman is now X425 for the rest of up until now. When this history teacher from Galveston, Texas, starts digging into his life, and then gets put on a podcast. So hopefully Lieutenant Sherman's family will push and bring him home, because if there's a kid that needs to be brought home, if there's somebody that needs some redemption, it's this poor kid from Turkey that is pretty much getting run out of every place he lived and just wanted to have a life for himself and his family.
Exactly. But the sad part about it is he's not buried as an unknown at the Manila American City.
He is buried as an unknown, and like I said, I'll bet my headphones here that he is X425.
I agree with you too. Yeah, and the sadder thing about it too is a Jewish service member being buried under a Latin cross.
Yeah. Well, I work with a Catholic priest who is very, very close, or actually an Orthodox priest who is very close with the Jewish community in town and has contacted the rabbi. So I don't know if Lieutenant Sherman has had the death prayers or not, but we're going to make arrangements to do it, the three of us, in his honor with Rabbi Cohen. So that's the least I can do. If I can't get him ID'd, at least I can. This research will bring some awareness, and I think his family, from the last reading I got, I think his family is in either Washington State or California, and they've been contacted by the U.S. Army Personnel Office, as have I. So, and I think that's because of the Enora Maru, they're trying to eliminate possibles on the Enora Maru. I don't know why they sent me a spit kit. But I provided the death certificate and the three positive, the three eyewitness accounts, and they still wanted it. So
they just wanted your DNA to see if you say you were.
It's pretty clear. If you look at my grandfather's picture and look at me, I think there's not a whole lot. There's not a whole lot of ifs there.
You just spent a lot of time digging into their little kingdom, so they wanted to find out exactly.
I am so deep into their dungeon, it's pitiful. 23 years of digging into their kingdom. So
yeah, that's one of the questions Aaron had. How long did it take you to uncover the whole story about your grandfather?
23 years, and I'm still working on it.
Still working on it.
Yeah.
So
my grandfather's part, I pretty much put it to bed. Well, not really, because I keep getting stuff on it. The in earnest effort started with my first trip to the reunion of the Botanic Regular Veterans in 1997 in Louisville, Kentucky. This is where I met Art Beal, who was the Orinoco Maru point person. Art took me in like I was his son. We had dinner every night. We had lots of long conversations. Art passed away in 2013. That hurt, because he and I became very, very close friends over a 15-year time period. And Art was in the Moji Hospital as well. He was in the wounded side. So he and my grandfather were not very far apart. But the greatest thing I can say about Art is with the Botanic Corridor reunion in San Antonio in 1999, I got to go to the Alamo with him. So here's a guy that was on Corregidor, and I'm walking through the chapel at the Alamo with him, and it just was kind of surreal. And then that night was the big banquet, and I found myself sitting at a table with Art, and 5 other Orinoco Maru survivors: Jack Heinzel, Gunnar Farrell, who was also in the Moji Hospital, one of the survivors, Maynard Booth, who ended up at Fukuoka number 3, and Ed Koenig, who was also in the Moji Hospital. So I, 25 years old, I'm sitting at a table with men who were a witness to my grandfather's death, and it just kind of said, you know what, I got a job to do here, and I don't know what it is, but I got one.
Exactly.
I got one, and I can't let it go. So then, that same reunion, another descendant shows up, and that descendant is Jim Erickson, Professor Jim Erickson, who, again, for 23 years, he and I have bounced ideas off of each other, and the cool thing about Jim is he showed me a list of men that his father had written down at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco after he got home from the Philippines while he was recovering. And on that list is my grandfather's name, Lieutenant Kelso. And fast forward to 2001, my grandmother passes away. And this is a topic that was never talked about in the open. So as we're cleaning out her house, or cleaning out all the scrapbooks and everything, I come across a scrapbook she had kept in the back of her closet about my grandfather, all the letters, all the little POW postcards, and in that scrapbook is a small piece of manila paper that says, Major Albert Erickson, Spearfish, South Dakota, has information for you. So apparently Jim's dad had contacted my grandmother after the war, and they spoke, and here we are 55 years later. They're his child and Lieutenant Kelso's grandchild connect at the American Defenders of Botanic Corridor reunion at a table full of Orinoco Maru survivors in 1999.
Yeah.
So after that, I made frequent trips to the archives and copied just about the entire Record Group 331 War Crimes trial on the Orinoco Maru, and at various times, when I would have some downtime from my career and raising my son, I would pull the files out and go over them, make jacket notes of who died here and whatever. And then I really started going over. I had a friend of mine who was an attorney who was in law school actually at the time, and I said, "Well, we'll take a look at this." I showed him the specifications from the Toshino War Crimes trial. And it's amazing what you see when you get a second set of eyes look at something. It wasn't the Orinoco Maru incident itself that got Lieutenant Toshino convicted. It was 2 events. It was one that he shot a prisoner aboard the Orinoco Maru, Lieutenant William Brewster, while he caught him in the galley. And the second was the San Fernando executions. Yep. Those were the 2 events that actually sent Toshino to the gallows.
And rightfully so.
So, fast forward, I guess, to 2014, I pretty much put, my personal research to my grandfather to bed. But I'm always interested in it, and I'm always interested in, the different facts about the Orinoco Maru. Well, then I get online to the Corregidor forum and pops up Chad Hill about the tennis court. And the big brouhaha starts over the tennis court and these MIAs from the tennis court. So I go out to the office, and I grab my big tub of Rubbermaid tub of files, and my wife's looking at me like going, "You're really going to get back into that?" I said, "Yeah, I got to." So I start going through the files, and I start writing down names. Anyway, I contact Chad on this Corregidor forum, and we start kicking stuff back and forth, and then it elevates into San Fernando, the MIAs at San Fernando. And then I start reading about John Eakin's lawsuit and what he had done with Cabanatuan. And I said, if he can do this with Cabanatuan, we can do this with the tennis court in San Fernando.
Exactly.
Because these guys are just as MIA as the Cabanatuan guys. And they got families just like the Cabanatuan guys. Why don't we just go ahead and do this? So Chad and Jim, and of course Jan Thompson from the American Independence Botanical Memorial Society. Jan's father was one of the men that helped carry my grandfather off the Brazil Maru. So Jan and Jim and I have become kind of like a little, three musketeers. We've been, very good friends. So, why don't we start trying to get these guys home too? We know who they are.
Exactly.
And this, in my opinion, is low hanging fruit.
It is. It's easy money or easy pickings, for the DPAA to do
Right.
these. And why they haven't, I have no idea.
And those are the questions I had. And of course, then the big brouhaha with Mr. Eakin's lawsuit, and the big shakeup at DPA or JPAC, which eventually became DPAA, and the shifting around and the moving around, and of course, the USS Oklahoma IDs, and now they're going to go after the Unora Maru because they've hit the 60% threshold there. And then, of course, they're doing the Cabanatuan. I think you told me they're doing the Cabanatuan IDs in the Philippines.
Yeah, it's over. I haven't gotten confirmation on this last one.
Okay.
But right at this point, it's looking about 127 possible.
I know there's over 900 unknowns from Cabanatuan.
Correct.
Am I right? Yeah.
But the problem is with the Cabanatuan ones, they were all misidentified to begin.
Yeah.
The ones they identified originally were actually misidentified and sent
Sure.
back to the States. So we're talking a couple thousand.
Yeah. Oh wow. Well, and again, what we talked about before, the guy who documented all the Cabanatuan deaths also documented the Orinoco Maru deaths, Captain Robert Kahn.
Yep.
If there's a hero in all of this, it's Captain Robert Kahn.
Yeah, he definitely deserved at least a distinguished service cross.
DSC at least. Yeah.
And they just
I don't know if you ever got it. I saw him. I've got a picture of him in his uniform after he came home. I didn't see a DSC or saw a Silver Star, but I don't think he was ever decorated for the efforts at Cabanatuan and the Orinoco Maru.
I wasn't just with all the POW.
Yeah, right.
Tobias Rosenfeld and
right.
all that he was responsible for figuring out.
And it's just unreal what a lot of families owe him, and hopefully we make it right one day. I've asked I've said something to my congressman about it, and wants me to write a letter and all that kind of good stuff. And so I'm gonna try to push to get Khan posthumously decorated. I know his daughter. I've made contact with his daughter. She prefers to stay private, and that's fine. I'm going to respect that.
Oh, yeah.
But she and I email back and forth, and I let her know what's going on with the Cabanatuan IDs, and she has conveyed her pleasure about what's going on with the Cabanatuan IDs and the efforts of you and John Eakin and Chad and me and Jim Erickson, and she's just overwhelmed with the fact that 70 years later her father's work is doing a lot of good.
Her father's work is paying off dividends, and it's bringing a lot of closure to a lot of families that were basically just buried under the ground as unknown.
Yeah, well, that's unacceptable in my mind.
To put it in kinder terms.
Yeah. As a family, as one of those families, I put myself in the position of what happened if one of those unknowns was my grandfather. I'd be screaming from the rooftop.
Yep. And
I can empathize with them, and I'm with them. I'm with them 100%, and I know you are too. You were telling me you had an uncle who's.
Yes, yeah. We're all family here.
Yeah, we are, and we got to scream from the rooftops to get them to act, and of course what John has done, what you're doing, and there's a bunch of us out there doing this. I love it. I love it. I think it's a noble cause to make this happen.
But it shouldn't be such a struggle with.
It shouldn't. It should
work with the DPA to get them to do these identifications. It's like when John in this last lawsuit, when they were trying to get Lieutenant Alexander Ninninger identified and some others, the DPAA lawyers, the federal lawyers, told the families that the families don't have a constitutional right to make them identify these men. So,
well, I think there's a law and a charter there that says they do.
well, they've got a mandate by Congress, that's for sure.
Yeah,
But,
there's definitely a congressional mandate. And I think that's what they call a law.
yeah, well,
So.
yeah, they told the federal judge the families don't have a constitutional right to make them.
any lawyer ought to know what a law is.
Exactly. So, well, anyway, that
works out.
And I appreciate you sharing about your.
I'm glad this is fun. I like to bring awareness of the issue that there's still 3,700 unknowns over Manila right now. And that's just Manila.
That's Manila. That wasn't
just Manila.
No. The punch bowl.
Right, and there's the Anara Maru guys in the punch bowl, and that's and a lot of people don't realize that the DNA technology, the advancement of DNA technology because of 9/11, IDing those bodies in New York is
we just need to get the DPAA to use that technology.
Exactly.
Still using outdated technology.
Right. This is technology that was invented just to ID those people in New York, and it works. I mean, look at all the IDs they're making from the World Trade Center. If we could approach the tenacity of bringing our men home from World War II and Vietnam, Korea, and the other wars the way they approached the tenacity of the 9/11 cases, this would be put to bed pretty darn quick.
Yep, I agree. Well, sir, I appreciate it.
John, thank you for having me. I really do. This has been wonderful. The 23-year journey to try to tell the story in a couple hours, but
yeah, it is. You have to skim over a lot of information that goes into.
Right, because we're gonna get off the podcast. I'm like, damn, I wish I said that to him or something else. But I'll stay in touch. I'll definitely stay in touch. We might be able to do a follow up on just the San Fernando or the tennis court.
And the thing that I wanted the listeners to really bring away from this is the fact that they, what they went through during the Battle of Bataan,
right,
or in the Philippines, right after December 7th.
Sure.
And then, being POWs for
right
however many years, until 1944 when they were put on the hell ships.
Right.
Their condition alone,
sure,
by the time that they even got on those hell ships and what they went through in the holes of those ships, getting bombed by and torpedoed by our own Navy, and how any of them made it even Japan.
It's amazing.
It is amazing. It's amazing they survived that long, and
then you get Lieutenant Sherman's story, where he was kicked out of his home at age 7 after World War I. And his family was having to run for their lives, and he decides to serve his new country, and then gets sent over to the Philippines, and this happens to him over there. I mean, poor kid can't get a break, and again, I hope his two sisters have since dead, but I know he has a nephew out there, and I hope his nephew will do the right thing here.
Yeah, he's got a nephew and a niece. I looked them up both today. So.
I know, like I said, I know the U.S. Army Personnel Command has been in contact with them, and I hope that I know they're going to do the right thing, but I hope DPAA does the right thing here, because it's pretty clear that Lieutenant Sherman is X-425.
Exactly. Yeah. All right, sir. Well, thank you very much for
John. This has been wonderful. So, are there any questions? Anybody out there need to ask any questions before we leave? Or?
No, we caught the few that Aaron had. A couple there that we answered. And,
okay.
I'm sure we got kind of nixed for the debates tonight. So
yeah, that's okay. We can do a follow up if you want later on.
Yeah, I don't want to get into any politics. I'm tired of
it. No, I don't either. I don't.
Yeah, that's why I was happy to do this tonight.
So. Yeah, me too. Me too. I'd rather do this than listen to those guys anyway.
Exactly.
But no, I if you want to do a follow up on just like San Fernando or the tennis court or something like that, we can.
We definitely will when we start digging more into those cases there and follow up on it and see if we can involve some of the other families.
Definitely.
That'd be a real cool deal.
Yep.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for stopping in tonight and listening. And again, I appreciate Mark coming on here and telling us about his grandfather Walter and his Walter's service and sacrifice for our country. It wasn't without men like him that we wouldn't be here today. So again, thanks, Mark, and we look forward to talking to you again.
John, it was an honor, and thank you very much as well.